I see that paper for a sec? Huh. That's odd. I thought that would be big news.
You thought what would be big news?
Well, there seems to be an absence of a certain ornithological piece. A headline regarding mass awareness of a certain avian variety.
What are you talking about?
Oh, have you not heard? It was my understanding that everyone had heard.
Heard what? Brian, don't!
The projections from the record of the obstructed contracts generates the corporation called David Boles, and that corporation called David Boles is based upon the obligation of the government to release the information which is not compromising intelligence, which they are keeping secret so that they could corner the market, at which point their insider trading being illegal was their obligation to release, and thus defining to the public that they had obstructed contracts. With the obstruction of contracts, they've facilitated a criminal activity which generates their obligation to pay the equivalent value in the restoration and reconstruction of those contracts' original value, generating the actual resume for the character David Boles, which is a company, at which point you generate all of the way back from the point of birth, which would be delivered to David as a person in order to make any particular adjustments if there was anything done or misappraised, etc. At which point the company, which could have easily existed in the 1950s, generates the projections of the assumptions so that those who engage in trading with the company of David can lean their speculations, creating their company and having that company act as insurance for schedule contracts inside David's projected history released by the courts, which is their obligation. With their leaning of those companies as the insurance, you have the development of the ability to make new companies which insure and protect the value from the contracts, from this speculation on how much that contract would have been worth, covering the entire value of the companies and products and services, etc. At which point their development of this system creates the reinforcement of the original schedule, allowing them to construct the ability to exchange with David before he's born, allowing for the progressive increase of the value of the network. With the increase of the value of the network, they have the algorithm which includes the bonus credit scores, which is similar to credit scores or brand loyalty. So like if you get like a specialty card like gasoline specials, Visa specials, some other company like this, you can increase your credit with that company or series of companies or network, at which point you're able to acquire better deals and exchanges with those companies in question, similar to the flying miles, which would have been an active aspect of the trades with the character from the company David Boles. At which point you have the creation of the zombie insurance, which is the foundational hardline baseline economy of the zombie apocalypse, which is the complete collapse of the United States structure down into its most basic sense, at which point the contracts building on the zombie apocalypse structure are vetted to the degree to survive the complete collapse of the society in question, allowing them to rely on it against all other collapses, which includes the second layer of insurances, which is the full coverage put system, which in case of the complete collapse of the system, the puts generate the ability to have survived or insured the collapse in question, allowing for the money to be redirected into the state of emergency survival arrangement, at which point you have the systematic development of these systems which can be traded on from those speculations, at which point you have the increased by the existence of the insurance of the company. You have the product, you have the insurance for that product. You could trade off the speculation of that company insuring the product, and you can trade off of the speculation of the insurance, which is the put option, and you can trade off the speculation of the zombie insurance. At which point, the speculators are everyone who would be leaning their products and companies and services and money against the product from the projection, allowing them to increase their network loyalty, which generates the algorithm which allows them to define how good the deals should be by the speculation, at which point the stewards over the company David Boles, such as the original teachers and tutors and work associations, would generate for themselves the ability to file the math together and just put everything in its proper order like a good steward would. At which point you have the manufacturer of these stewards, who themselves generate the ability to speculate off of, as their decisions and possibilities create diverse opportunities inside the market, which allows for the companies to lean upon the exchange, at which point you have the complete covering of the idea for the company, which allows them to trade off of the court-protected contract schedule for David Boles. So no matter what happens, the United States government has to deliver on these contracts as a protected system, and thus its organization of the companies and delivery of the product services under the qualified arrangements has to happen by definition. So they're not trading off of a Ponzi scheme because the law demands the existence of these things. And since you have the creation of these compounding affairs, you have the definition of David's network. At which point, if the projection says that David's going to change his name so that Don Sr. Boles can make a contract trade in order to manage quantitative easing after the crash of '08, then he has to change his name by definition in order to disassociate from the arrangement, so that he can impartially, as a third party, not be compromised as influencing or subverting on behalf of one party or another, instead of being an impartial third party. Now, under this assumption, you have the development of the horoscope, which is Libra Tiger, at which point David Tiger can be a projected alternative name, at which point you have the creation of art, such as the development of childhood cartoons, such as the development of Peter Parker as Spider-Man, whose Mary Jane consistently, in order to be cute, sends him off saying Tiger, go get him Tiger, and all of that jazz, at which point you have the construction of these pieces of art, of meta, which would be contracted by David Boles' company in order to increase the meta concept or the zeitgeist of David Boles, in order to generate the art reaffirming of his culture, which generates the consistent alignments with these exchanges. And the more of those types of trades happen, the more those companies align with David's network, at which point you can begin speculating off of them, which includes the increased, based upon competent reliability, of the investment of the network into those companies in order to produce these kinds of products. At which point it's similar to product advertising, except the product is David Boles through the projections, at which point you have the full diversity of the projected culture, which is constantly reaffirmed in their contracted art, which generates their ability to manufacture the speculation for the culture in question, at which point you have a social contract that can be generally molded together by the stewards, which could only really be changed by David, as he is the patriarchy. With the birth of David as the patriarchy, you have Boss Baby's arrangements of rearranging anything that he feels that the stewards did incorrectly about any of the customs or culture or policies, etc., at which point he is a constitutional kingdom from their projections, at which point the manufacture of the projected schedule, where California has to make David separate from the United States to start his own country, making a constitutional kingdom, making this society under his control of citizens, their own legal society, at which point the prevention of them to make their society is an act of genocide to erase an entire people from off the face of the planet. At which point you have the arrangement of the psychopath Nazi genocidal freaks who would be responsible for the obstruction of contracts, which has historically subverted the American economy. Now, the subversions of those legal contracts, which are by definition speculated and thus legal contracts, generates every one of those groups which feels that they would have been blocked illegitimately. The culture, in order to not be genocided, would have to have been constructed under these projected compounding interests, which facilitates the stewards as teachers, tutors, maids, butlers, etc., who are particularly organizing the arrangements of the ordinary living conditions or standards, which includes the progression into the estimate of the kingdoms, where David's would be creating the mechanism of the palaces for the embassies and consulates, which have to be fully staffed and function under their projected contract schedules, for the projectors to exponentially compound under those arrangements, which allows for the trade treaties with the countries in relationship, at which point those trade treaties allow for the consistent reinforcing of the speculation of David's existence as the savior of Europe, in order to reinforce the estimate for the savior of Europe arrangement. At which point those countries would have the backup economy of David's country through the stewards who are maintaining the common culture under the estimate of David, which is built upon their common normalization and organization under the anticipation of David's birth, at which point this is the culture that he would be born with, qualifying him as king under a constitutional kingdom, which means that David is the only one who would be able to change those customs, policies, laws, etc. At which point you have the active maintaining of those arranged agreements, at which point the only way for David to trade with the Soviet Union countries is for them to tear down the Iron Curtain, at which point David can't make a treaty with them until they remove the Iron Curtain, at which point it becomes a compounding speculation mystery, which means that many members of the market would be generating the steward position of anticipation of the large investment into the Soviet Union after they reduce their trade barring or permanent sanctions on the rest of the world. In the case that the Soviet Union would remove their barring of the economic exchanges, when that goes down, then they can start doing so, at which point you have large collections of stored value, which is merely, it exists in anticipation of its redelivery, at which point you have the storage of those maintained economy mechanisms, which generate inside the other treaty-holding nations, which would be easily accessible to the Soviet Union once they reduce the Iron Curtain, at which point those countries, which are immediately in its proximity that would be able to gain treaties with David, would be storing lots of the preparations for the delivery of the projections, at which point the speculators, being able to do so, can create the rest of their market on top of David as a country's arrangements, allows for David to lean into the position as the stored up dam, waiting for the release of his engagements with the treaties and economic trades, is also going to exponentially store up with the additional aspects of the market, which can double as trading functions as an advantage in the treaty-holding nations, which are creating the economic exchanges in order to generate the storage in question, for the moving, in which case it becomes its own active, maintained permanent market, at which point, even at the point that the delivery of the products is sent to Russia, you still have the base structure, which can easily recover at that same stored bulk rate, at which point you have the projection for their original economic trade value for the exchange value, which is his contributions to those countries, which gives them the value of giving advantages to David, at which point the exchange value through the treaty is certified at those prices. So if he contributes 1,000,000 units, they are incentivized to defend the preservation of them receiving those 1,000,000 units for the equivalent value of the 1,000,000 units, at which point you have the fair trade exchange of who wants specific particular products, allowing for the normal function of their economy, which compounds the speculators exponentially, which is the normal function of an economy, at which point the function of the idea of David Boles is the existence of order and trade. The fair trade organization is the entire identity of David's core definition under that arrangement, and that being the arrangement would be contributed to David's original education through the School of Hard Knox for him to study his core definition as an interest of the network, at which point he would easily be able to make any particular adjustments which would seem reasonable at any particular time in an actively evolving economy. So, much like fashion, which David's character as a company would be involved in, each of these arrangements would be functionally seasonal, but the seasonal culture or customs would be separate to the fashion season. It's a larger unit, at which point the exchange of that would have to make its own adjustments for the speculators in order to certify the predictions of future seasons in question, which can be validated and insured against, which is the stable, unmoving market through the existence of compounding bonds, which is the primary interest of the company, which is increasing the amount of potential trades from the rest of the market in order to collect into the brokerage, which allows them the advantage through merely protecting the most amount of things, at which point the trade of those who are projecting to David's company would create the company and provide the exchange to the company of the fully functioned business. So if we're discussing, for instance, makeup, the creation of that projection of that company would be normalized and standardized under the projected contract schedule, which allows them to make the final legitimate vettable full amount, which can be fully insured, at which point the trading of that company for credit scores would allow for the maintaining of actively viable companies to be controlled by the stewards in David's absence until he can observe it, which qualifies David's starting assets, which would generate David's original accounts or how much money he would have available in cash available to make any of the other various exchanges, which would be put against as the account value available allows the speculators to make trades under the position of making those exchanges for the cash in question, at which point it being business money can be actively exchanged through the speculator's interest, compounding and exponentially increasing the value of the company under the economy, at which point all laws, taxes, etc. would normally be arranged under these exchanges for the interest under the speculation, such as the speculation of taking tax breaks versus not taking tax breaks, which is generating the argument of what he wants from the government. And if he wants from the government the full exchange under X, Y, or Z, he would provide a larger payment to them for the taxation function, increasing the value that they would have available, at which case they're incentivized to do that which requires them to make the trade, which makes them make the political currency as an exchange with David's character, at which point David's political party, collecting the political currency in question, incentivized the company to increase the amount of taxes paid to the states, federal governments, or other countries, regardless of their particulars. At which point you have the summary assumption of the basic outline that David's enemies were using when they said that David was a catastrophic threat to them, qualifying their criminal act of war, otherwise known as the War on David, which they generated specific policies in order to create a rubber stamp attack against the dismantling and destruction of David as an economic force in order to destabilize and destroy the rest of the American and world order and economy.